Afternoon, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. This is Eric Sellers now, Senior Advisor at JFF. I lead our Center for Apprenticeship and Work-Based Learning. We're still having people log on, so give me about a minute and we'll get started. Just want to thank you for making the time today, and we'll get moving momentarily. Just stand by for 1 second if you wouldn't mind. Got plenty of people logging in. Okay, so a few people have been joining. Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. We have a really large group that will be joining us today for this important conversation on race and registered apprenticeship. Again, I'm Eric Sellers now with Jobs for the Future. I've spent some time running state workforce boards, doing reentry work, local workforce boards, Department of Labor, and now I've been at JFF for the last 3 years. And we do a ton of apprenticeship work, so I appreciate you joining. Welcome in honor of Black History Month. That will go to the end of this month, and thank Gerald Ford for signing it into, I don't know if it's law or recognition or whatever, but 1976 Black History Month goes back to. So this is a really important conversation on race. We know that in registered apprenticeships across the country, there is issues and concerns about the history of apprenticeship, women accessing apprenticeship, Latinos, Hispanics accessing apprenticeship, people with disabilities, and African Americans. And there's a lot of underrepresentation in those groups in registered apprenticeship. We have a long history in this country of racism and challenges in the general workforce that, of course, are inextricably tied to registered apprenticeship, right? So registered apprenticeship isn't necessarily on its own racist or different than anywhere else. It is tied to the 300-year history, 400-year history of white supremacy and oppression and those sort of things. So that's what we want to talk about today, and we want to be as honest as we can about what's going on around the country and what's been going on. If you look at the history in this country back to indentured servitude, how slaves were so-called apprenticed with no pay, terrible conditions, and just another way of slavery. We see that was a history in 16 and 1700s, in the early 1800s, in the 1800s, and during Reconstruction, apprenticeship for former slaves and freedmen and freedwomen was also a terrible situation. Apprentices were assigned to apprentices in court. They were bound many times to their former masters, and the so-called apprenticeships in the later part of the 1800s was a real, was not what it is today, let's put it that way. It was really a sort of imprisonment and cheap labor and keeping the labor force and freed slaves down. And they were rather effective at doing that. When we get into the 1900s and industry and building America's cities, African Americans were underrepresented in that. And then, even after the National Apprenticeship Act of 1937 and through the 60s, there was incredible underrepresentation of African Americans. They were not given opportunities and good jobs. It went to family and cousins and people they knew in the unions. The unions were like the rest of the country and had racist ideas. So African Americans were not given access or provided really access to apprenticeship. And when they were low skilled and low wage. So now we go to today and we look at the data and we look at the representation of African Americans, which is still under their representation in the workforce. And there's a couple of studies out there that talk about the wage disparities today between African Americans and their white counterparts, with a rather substantial. We'll be putting a blog out on this in a couple of days with a little bit more detail. But there's a sordid history in this country. Apprenticeship is tied to the racist policies of the past and lingering today. So, we're all trying to do this work to increase diversity and equity in apprenticeship. Department of Labor has been trying to do that for 6 years. The unions are trying to do it now. State apprenticeship agencies are. There's a lot of folks that are trying to do this. But is there more we can do? Can you use apprenticeship as an outreach and equity and diversity tool? Some employers think so. We have to really focus on outreach, and we have to have purpose and intentionality to level the playing field for all underrepresented groups, and then certainly given all the social justice issues for the last year for African Americans. So purpose and intentionality, and maybe doing a little bit more work or a lot more work in this area is important. We at JFF, that's our North Star, and we really want to level the playing field for all. So we're joined today with a fabulous crew. It'll be led by our Deborah Kobus, and we have Joseph Hollins from the great state of Louisiana, Patricia Morrison from Virginia, and Joshua Johnson from the great state of Wisconsin. So they're going to get started in a minute. I want to thank you all for joining today. Again, this is a huge response and a huge group, and together we can hopefully move the needle on access and opportunity in registered apprenticeship. One last note: if you look at the White House website, you'll see a notice by the president the other day about strengthening registered apprenticeship. So I would urge you all to go check it out on LinkedIn or the White House website to see where the president's going with this, and equity and diversity is a priority for this administration as well. So with that, I want to say thanks for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to Deborah Kobus. Deborah's my deputy at the department at JFF, and I'll kick it off to you, Deborah. Thank you, and thanks everybody for joining.
Hi, thanks, Eric. And thank you all so much for joining today. This is a really important discussion, and one that I'm really excited to be a part of and to learn from. And so just to sort of start things off, I can see there are a lot of people that have joined already. And so if you're not familiar with JFF, we're a nonprofit national intermediary that's been around for over 35 years. And a big focus of our work is increasing economic opportunity for those who have not had access to them. And so racial justice is a key part of our mission. And that extends into what you are going to be hearing about today. And so just to kick things off, I'll give a little bit of a sense of the work that we're already doing in the apprenticeship space and how we've tied that to diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have a few federal contracts right now with the Department of Labor. The first is Apprenticeship Expansion and Modernization Fund. So here we have a real focus on opportunity youth. And our strategy here has been primarily about diversity and access. So can we work with workforce boards and community-based organizations that serve a population largely of racial and ethnic minorities who haven't been involved in registered apprenticeship? And that can be a way to start to expand access and really build the registered apprenticeship system in places where it hasn't been before. At the same time, we have a youth apprenticeship contract where we're focusing on in-school youth. And so here it's a different lens on equity. We really need to make sure that we're not accidentally or intentionally creating barriers to people to enter apprenticeship. And as part of this work, we're a national partner in the Partnership to Advance Youth Apprenticeship, and equity is one of the core principles that they've defined in how to build out youth apprenticeship programs for in-school youth. Next, we have what we call IDEA M. It's a manufacturing expansion program, and here we're looking to enroll 50% of apprentices from underrepresented populations. And so this is a combination of looking at race and gender. And really trying to build out, as Eric pointed out, some of the challenges in the registered apprenticeship system reflect the challenges in workforce overall. So some of the challenges in the manufacturing sector around race and equity we'll be looking to confront through apprenticeship expansion. And then I just wanted to flag a few completed projects that also particularly looked at equity issues. One, we had a contract focused entirely on equity and really building out the partnerships that are needed to build a more equitable apprenticeship system. We've also convened dozens of employers that are engaged in apprenticeship to understand better how they're approaching equity within their work and trying to identify the strategies that they would recommend to other employers to build out equity within their apprenticeship program. And then we were a partner on a grant called GOAL, where we translated the related technical instruction within the IMT registered apprenticeship program into Spanish to create access for non-English speakers. Again, in the manufacturing sector, there are a lot of challenges across the workforce, and one of them is that many Spanish speakers can get entry-level jobs in the sector but have trouble advancing. And so this is an advancement strategy. So that's just a snapshot of some of the work that JFF has done focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion in apprenticeship. And we're really looking forward to today's conversation to learn about all the other ways that we can continue to work in this space. As Eric mentioned, there's an ongoing challenge with race in registered apprenticeship. And this comes up both through gender and race and the intersection of the two. And so very specifically, if you look at Black apprentices versus other apprentices, there's a huge wage disparity. So Black workers and Black apprentices are engaging at about the same rate as the overall labor market, as in the overall labor market. So it's not that Black apprentices are underrepresented, it's that they're entering apprenticeship programs that don't offer the same wages. And if I were to show the full span of race and ethnicity, other apprentices by demographics make as much or more than white apprentices. So this isn't a racial issue across a number of races. This is specifically a challenge that Black apprentices continue to face around wages. And then when you look at intersectionality, when you bring gender into the picture, you can see an even more complicated picture. Women are less likely to participate in registered apprenticeship as a whole, and they face large disparities relative to their male counterparts in terms of wages. And so you can see that women really make less than men of any racial or ethnic demographic characteristic. And the only reason why there's a smaller wage disparity between Black women and Black men is because Black men, again, are not earning as much as other apprentices. And so there's, a really large and present problem there. And there's a little bit as well of other factors that don't show up here, but there's a regional component to this. So in the Midwest, that's actually where you have the largest wage disparity. And you also find that Black apprentices, both men and women, are more likely to be incarcerated. So they're actually, in many cases, earning a sub-minimum wage, which is pulling down that overall wage average. And then again, returning to the intersection between race and gender, men are whiter than women overall, and so women are much more significantly likely to be Black. About 20% of registered apprenticeships that are female are Black, which is about double what it is for the white apprentices. So there are just a number of sort of structural differences that you see when looking at race and gender in registered apprenticeship. And more organizations, as Eric mentioned, are looking to figure out how to change this. And I should say that these data come from the Center for American Progress. So thank you to them for their excellent analysis and reporting on race and gender in registered apprenticeship. And so I think, that's just to provide a general backdrop to what the current situation is in terms of wages. That doesn't get into, a lot of the nuances, not only around inclusion in terms of becoming an apprentice, but also what the Black and Latinx and other, racial minorities experiences are as apprentices on the job site, in the classroom. So I'm really looking forward to that nuanced discussion today. And to do that, I'm going to turn it over to Joseph Hollins. He's the former state apprenticeship director for Louisiana, and the host of a podcast series with a number of state apprenticeship directors from around the country, looking at a variety of aspects of registered apprenticeship at the state level. He's currently a special assistant to the governor of Louisiana and has been tackling a number of issues beyond apprenticeship, like the COVID pandemic and other critical work in the state. So Joseph, thanks for joining us, and I really appreciate your taking the time today to talk with us and the audience and the state apprenticeship directors. And the last thing I'll say before I hand it to you is we will be monitoring the chat and trying to save time at the end of the discussion for some of the questions that come up in the chat. There'll also be JFFers who will be responding to the chat in real time. So please feel free to ask questions in the chat throughout the day.
Thanks, Deborah. Thank you for having me. I'm very, very excited about this conversation that we're going to have today. It's such a critical and important conversation. And today with me, as I thought about this conversation that we were going to be having, I remember reading a speech that Dr. King gave, and it's a speech that he gave in 1961 at the Fourth Constitutional Convention of the AFL-CIO. And the name of the speech was, "If the Negro wins, labor wins." And so in that speech, Dr. King bemoans how Negroes and Black folks have been kept from entering high-paying wages and jobs by unions because they haven't been given the opportunity to enter into apprenticeship. And he reminds the labor movement of how in their struggle for democratic rights that they ultimately ended up having economic gains and also at the same time gaining the respect of the country. And he tells these labor unions that if they would join the fight for equity, that they once again would have economic gains and they once again would have the respect of the country. And so that quote just stuck out to me so much. We know that registered apprenticeship is more than just labor unions now in America. And we know that the issue is more than just Black and white, but the quote still rings true that if registered apprenticeship would engage in the work of equity, then they will see companies who engage in this work will see economic gains, and they will also gain the respect of the country. And so it's my hope that as we have this conversation, we have some great panelists for you, that as we have this conversation, that each of you who are watching would catch that vision and see that this is a very important work as we talk about race and registered apprenticeship. And so today with me, we have Joshua Johnson, who is the State Director of Apprenticeship in the state of Wisconsin. And Josh is fairly new to the role, but he's been there in that department for quite some time and has done the work and has great ideas. And then we also have Trish Morrison, who is the State Director in Virginia. And Trish also has great ideas, has done this work. And these are two very thoughtful people that are joining us today. And so if you have any questions, again, as Deborah said, just put them in the chat and we'll save some time at the end to answer some of your questions. Trish and Josh, why don't y'all come on up and join me? So Trish and Josh, thank you both for joining us today for this conversation. We'll start with ladies first. Trish, tell us a little bit about Virginia and some of the work that you've done there as the director to increase minority participation in registered apprenticeship.
Well, thank you for having us, Joseph. I know Joshua and I are thrilled to be able to highlight the state programs. Virginia's a little bit unique. We have a lot of small and mid-sized companies. I literally have about 2,400 program sponsors in the state, with about another 900 employers that participate as signatories through my large union programs. So we have a pretty wide reach of that, and about 11,000 apprentices going through the revolving door at any given time, and in about 180 different occupations. Of course, Virginia adopted the Voluntary Apprenticeship Act in 1938, right after the federal, so we've got a real long presence here. We do try to also cross-pollinate with agencies who are workforce practitioners or who can touch potential apprentices, the Department of Veterans Services, Virginia Department of Corrections, Virginia Employment Commission, Social Services. Even we go to the cities like Richmond, which has its own Office of Community Wealth Building, specifically designed to deal with the very large African American population who's been left behind in the city of Richmond. And speaking of the cities, we have Norfolk, Richmond, and Fairfax, which are all very large, very diverse cities. Now, our population is quite diverse in that we service 5 different service trades for apprenticeship: barber, cosmetologist, the esthetician program, and nail technician. And that brings a lot of diversity inherently. And we serve a lot of Spanish, Korean, Vietnamese, and African American in those particular occupations. Our licensure agency even provides the examination for licensure in Spanish, Vietnamese, and Korean. So there is some movement to accommodate and help those populations be really part of that supply chain for apprenticeship.
I think you're muted, Joseph.
I apologize. I was just saying, Josh, what are your thoughts?
So a little bit about registered apprenticeship here in the great state of Wisconsin. We hold the illustrious title of holding the first registered apprenticeship law in 1911. And the Fitzgerald Act was passed in 1937 for the National Apprenticeship System. So I always have to start out anytime I talk about apprenticeship in Wisconsin to let everyone know that we hold that illustrious title. But we're really excited here in Wisconsin as we serve about 14,000 active apprentices a year with active programs in 10 sectors, with about 3,000 employers who utilize registered apprenticeship in the state. And a lot of the work that we've done to try and build and to try to assist our employers with recruitment and retention really has been driven by the data that we continue to get every year. This last year, we received data that there were 10% minorities statewide in all apprenticeship sectors, with 6% of them being women, or 6% women participating in registered apprenticeship. So those numbers are my constant drive to push me forward in how we want to focus on building strong programs here in the state of Wisconsin. And in later questions, I'll talk about some of the strategy that we used to get that going and to get that moving forward. But we were really excited in 2019. We saw some notable gains among minority and female inclusion statewide with Latino women or with Latinos, hitting 5% for the first time ever. And then women in general hitting 3% participation statewide in construction for the first time in nearly 2 decades. So the work definitely is being done. It needs to be done. We definitely need our employers to help support this work. But I'm very excited to join the conversation today.
Thanks, Josh and Trish. So we talk about how important this conversation is, but the question may be, why is the conversation so important? So if both of you could try to tackle, why do you think registered apprenticeship is so important to the economic equity of minorities in this country? Josh, we'll let you go first this time if you want to tackle that, and then we'll hear from you, Trish.
Definitely, thank you. The way I look at it, with no program in the nation as its rival, registered apprenticeship is poised and perfectly positioned to get ahead of the curve on this initiative of economic equity for minorities in America, in our country. With an outline, the apprenticeship outline that explains pretty much every detail of training from on the job to related instruction that an apprentice will receive, we're ensuring that anyone who is a registered apprentice gains those skills needed and is recognized as a skilled worker once they complete and they are in this highly competitive market that we have. Having these documented skills and competencies, we can make it a lot harder for an employer to judge somebody by the color of their skin instead of recruiting for the skills they need. Apprenticeship is the one tool that can easily eliminate that and give that ability for those employers when someone does finish an apprenticeship to really look and see at the skills they gain. But the trick is getting them into the apprenticeship in the front. And that's where the real work becomes partnering with the employers to help them understand what it is they need to do and why. So that's why it's so important to create those access points into RA. I've noticed in my community, born and raised in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, we don't learn anything about apprenticeship in my community. I became an apprentice at the age of 27 years old, but my dad didn't know anything about it. And I find many folks in the underrepresented population communities have no clue what registered apprenticeship is. So making those access points visible and understandable, because apprenticeship is one of the best and most direct paths to a middle class income, and it doesn't come with paralyzing school debt. But the key is educating the communities and the service providers, because that's what we have to remember too. We talk about some of our communities. The church is one of the strongest voices in some of our communities, educating those service providers about those access points. And one of the misplaced insecurities surrounding affirmative action and equal opportunity is that there's a limited number of opportunities facing increased demand and competition. But if we can bring registered apprenticeship to more employers and sectors, then we have expanding opportunities to meet that demand or need for family supporting jobs, especially in underrepresented. And lastly, I went into a company a couple years ago, and we were putting on mechatronics apprentices. Mechatronics is basically a mix of maintenance and electronics and the robotics automation. And when I went in to do the presentation to put on the 6 new apprentices, they were 6 white males. Well, I always ask this question when I go in, and I love asking these questions. Can I take a tour? Can we go on a tour of your facility? And when we went on a tour, the minute I stepped onto that shop floor, I saw Black and Latino men and women working in those entry level jobs. So the first question I asked the CEO and his president of operations for the apprenticeship side, what are you doing to create pathways for those individuals right there who are working, who are doing this skilled work? What are you doing to create pathways for them into these highly skilled occupations such as mechatronics? And you could almost hear a pin drop when I asked that question, because they weren't ready for the answer, or they weren't ready to answer that question. And essentially what that meant is they're doing nothing. So from that point forward, I work with my staff to continue to help those businesses, as that business as well as others, to understand you already have them in your door. They're in your workforce. Why not get them skilled up and get them into these highly skilled occupations to make them move into that middle class, or to move into those high skilled occupations? Thank you.
And Trish, I know we've had this conversation privately a few times, and so I'll let you answer that as well.
Everything Joshua says is spot on, but I'm going to give you a different perspective. I'd like to appeal to the competitive edge from the employer point of view and their bottom line. And I did a Qualtrics survey of my folks and asked them, where do you likely get your pipeline? Where is your next best apprentice coming from? And I gave them several different options in a drop down in that survey. The stats came back. 80% said they find their next apprentices through word of mouth. Okay, that's great. So if word of mouth means you've got predominantly white men on your floor, then you're not tapping into Latino, to women, to African Americans, to natives, to anybody in the LGBTQI community, because they're not there to perform any good word of mouth to bring new, great employees to your establishment. It's all about your competitive edge. And so that economic factor is what should be waking employers up, that if they don't change the culture and the leadership decisions from the top, then those people are going to go somewhere else. And the supply and demand will leave them behind, because this pendulum is swinging. We do have pent up demand. And as Joshua and I and all my counterparts continue to penetrate into those communities and say, hey, ask better for yourself. Don't go in a CNA job at $8 an hour. If you could go in and do $17 an hour and learn a welding program with the iron workers, which loves to hire women into those sorts of trades. So it's about your competitive edge as an employer. If you want to tap into that market, you've got to be intentional about who's in your landscape.
I agree with both you, Josh and Trish. And so we both know, both of you all know as directors, and for the good of the conversation and audience, because everyone may not be as familiar with registered apprenticeship, Registered apprenticeship has regulations found in 29 CFR 29 that says that every program has to have an EEO plan and an affirmative action plan. And Josh and Trish, as state directors and their counterparts, set benchmarks for companies that says you should have this much minority participation, you should have this much female participation. And so I know Josh and Trish, both of you all and many directors have lamented that these regulations sometimes lack teeth. And so, what do you like about 29 CFR 30, and what do you also wish that could change about 2930? Trish, you could go first on this one.
Well, Joseph, I'd like to focus on the self-identification disability question in 2930. I feel that participants still may be skittish to answer that question. Do you or do you not have a disability? There's still going to be distrust as to whether or not the employer is somehow going to use that in an inappropriate way in judging them. That's one thing. So I don't think that mechanism of determining if we're serving people with different abilities is really going to work out the way they anticipate it's working out. They're going to get a lot of either non-answers or not accurate answers. What I'm trying to do here is I reached out to the Department of Aging and Rehab Services. We are going to create a policy between the two agencies that not only helps a participant answer that question, but I'm not one that wants to ask questions or collect data for the sake of doing that. I want to know what the return on investment is for any sort of data collection point, or if you can provide a solution. So what we're going to do is not only ask that question, but we're going to give them an opportunity to make a referral to someone in DARS, which is an agency that provides technical assistance to folks with differing abilities. And they have a lot of money to help do that, a lot of money for accommodation. We've had apprentices that go all the way through a program and can't pass a final test because they never told anyone they were dyslexic or they needed some help in the testing operation. So once we can normalize people saying, yep, this is who I am, this is what I have, this is how I can be helped, then we want the agency that's here to design to help those folks actually provide some services.
And exactly, off of piggybacking off of what Trish said, I think the regulation is helpful and it's a step above the past regulations that we have, which was long overdue for revision. But the new regulation is so statistically centric that I think the message does get lost a little bit. We'd be interested in exploring changes where the targeted outreach and other affirmative action activities are required for all larger programs. So more energy is focused on doing the actual AA work as opposed to figuring out what work needs to be done for whom, right? This way, even if a sponsor is meeting their goals, we may not see the harm and continue to target those populations or focus on those populations so the numbers don't slide or even surpass those traditional goals. One of the things that I stepped into as the director in December of 2019, and even prior to that, under the illustrious Karen Morgan, who some of you may be very familiar with, was the previous director. We looked at and I had conversations, and I said, I am not interested in passing any more of our sponsors on good faith efforts if when I review their compliance reviews, I do not see good faith. And what I mean by that is finding out who they need to reach out to, reaching out to those organizations and bringing them in and having conversations with them to recruit them, but also reaching out to those organizations for retention so that those individuals that they do hire from underrepresented populations will have the support they need to retain their apprenticeship and to support their apprenticeship activities as they go throughout. To me, that was one of the things that when we had conversations, about the new regulation, we really had to focus on. We created, here in Wisconsin, we created an AAEEO handbook that is essentially broken up by technical college districts, 16 districts across the state. And it has in those districts, it has everyone in those districts that are CBOs, disability services, vets, you name it, any CBO or any type of organization that helps support underrepresented populations is in that handbook. And it's broken into tech college districts because that's who the employers in those areas, they pay their taxes to those districts. So the hope is that we can encourage those employers to reach out to those entities in the handbook, the AEEO handbook, to help them with their recruitment and retention. To date, we are in the process of rolling out the new regulation, that CFR 2930. Obviously, COVID really put a slowdown to everything we were doing, but that is one way that we look at advancing those efforts and really moving those efforts forward.
Josh, I think that is a perfect segue into our next question. We know that there are many CBOs and organizations out there, such as the NAACP, the Urban League, the Hispanic Heritage Foundation, and these CBOs, their focus is the enrichment of minority communities. How can those in the registered apprenticeship space, whether it be program sponsors, prospective employers, colleges, how can the different entities in the registered apprenticeship space engage these organizations to add diversity to their program? And Josh, I'll let you pick up where you left off, and Trish, we'll go to you next.
Perfect. Thank you. So in Wisconsin, many of the CBOs are already connected to registered apprenticeship through our creation of the certified pre-apprenticeship programs. So we have the Madison Urban League, Social Development Commission, UMOS, United Migrant Opportunity Services. They headline 3 of the CBOs in our state who have programs, certified pre-apprenticeship programs for construction, manufacturing, culinary arts, etc. We have identified that the untapped talent pools that our employers need to recruit are typically connected to our CBOs. But we also found out that our CBOs don't understand how to access the RA system. So if you don't know how to access the system, the talent pool that you have that would be fantastic has nowhere to go but away from apprenticeship. So those CBOs have access to federal grant dollars as subawardees in some of our grants, our expansion grants, and they use those to conduct apprenticeship activities. We can also engage them and listen to and educate those CBOs about the opportunities involved in registered apprenticeship. Many times our communities and those agencies that serve them are not properly informed about RA and its access points. One of the positions we created with the federal expansion grant, apprenticeship expansion grant, was an apprenticeship navigator. And that navigator's role is, in essence, to navigate a person through the Wisconsin apprenticeship system, to take them from the point where they are a participant or an interested person to get them into an apprenticeship. So the creation of that position allows the CBOs, workforce boards, and other entities to become connected to what apprenticeship is about. One internal thing that we've done within Wisconsin Apprenticeship that I'm very proud of that really helps this and helps this whole strategy of getting connected to CBOs. Internally, when we looked at our staff about 4 years ago, we looked and we didn't have representation from anyone that would even be remotely connected to these CBOs. So what we did internally was we started to recruit into our staff a diverse culture into the Wisconsin apprenticeship staff. So as of 2016, there were 2 persons of color, myself and another field rep working in Wisconsin apprenticeship. And as of January 21, there are now 7 staff of color, including myself. And the vision that I had there, and I shared this with the former director, it was important that as a regulatory body to reflect the diversity we were preaching to our sponsors, to our apprenticeship sponsors. In addition, many of our sponsors indicated they were unsure of how to recruit from those pools of underrepresented populations. So the thought process was, if we put staff in place that look like those that we want our employers to hire, our employers and sponsors may feel much more comfortable having those conversations and having open dialogue with those Wisconsin apprenticeship staff members on how to recruit. And lastly, probably the most important part, one thing we found about that is those individuals from those construction committees or from manufacturing sponsors or from some of our other 10 sectors, they actually reached out to those employees of color that worked with Wisconsin apprenticeship staff and asked them to tag along when they went to do outreach, because they wanted to make sure that what they were saying was appropriate and understood by the community they were doing outreach to. So we looked at it as an internal process, but also now those people who have no clue how to do that outreach to those other areas, we now have internal staff who are working with those CBOs and who have been connected to those CBOs in previous work life, and now they're able to help make that connection and to bridge that gap, so to speak.
Yeah, well, thank you for that, Josh. And Trish, I think you provide really unique perspective on the work that the employers need to do. And so, can you tell us a little bit about what an employer needs to do to engage these CBOs to make their apprenticeship better?
Well, I'm gonna play with your question a little bit, Joseph, and I'm gonna add a couple of words.
Take
You know,
liberties.
the CBOs have to work at it, and of course we in the administration have to work at it, but you hit on it. It is the employers that drive this train all the way. They still maintain the ability and responsibility to recruit and select their own apprentices. And to piggyback on what Josh said about the optics and the representation, and hey, let me bring my Black coworker along because that helps me fit into this situation. I mean, we know what's going on there, but I'm going to give you 3 examples that talk about why this is a leadership decision. And as Eric started off by saying, it's an intentionality decision. Because it's Black History Month, one of my favorite movies, Hidden Figures, is being played everywhere. Love that movie, and I wanted to share the one really scene that just got me on that. And I researched an author who was kind of analyzing the movie. Her name is Anna Silman, and she says this: Hidden Figures is an important act of counter history about inscribing forgotten heroines into the public record. But it's also an important reminder of how blinding prejudice can be. How many hidden things are actually just things we choose not to see. And all of that was so that she could explain her favorite scene, which is where NASA boss, played by Kevin Costner, innocently discovers his mathematician heroine has to go half a mile to use a restroom. That scene is really, really important. And what it says to me is when he realizes what's going on, takes that crowbar, knocks down the toilet sign, and turns around to his entire mostly white staff and says, at NASA, we all pee the same color. I mean, that's a little crass, but that leadership right there sends the message to your entire workforce of what is and is not tolerated, or what is and is not should be sought after. That's example number 1. Example number 2 is I like to escape with silly television and have been watching The Masked Singer and The Masked Dancer on good old Fox channel here. What I think employers might benefit from is, what if their applicants were in masks? What if they couldn't tell what race they were, or what gender they were, or any of that? Maybe they were a veteran with a prosthetic left arm. Do they really need to know those things to, as Joshua said, look at the merit of that candidate and bring them into the fold? I think it would be surprising if they didn't actually have to figure out, is this a man or a woman, or what race we're seeking? I mean, go in a little bit more neutral. And the last example I'll give you about leadership and optics, and again, how it's going to affect your bottom line, is recently Yoshiro Mori was the International Olympic Committee chief, 81-year-old Japanese man who said he didn't think women belonged in boardrooms because they talked too much and he found it annoying. Well, guess what happened? 800 volunteers immediately withdrew from the Olympic Committee. Toyota and Coca-Cola, who are billion-dollar sponsors, made statements saying, this does not comport with our values. Eventually, money is going to talk. And when women see culture that doesn't support women, or if people of color see cultures that are not welcoming to them, they're going to take their dollar elsewhere. They're also going to take their labor force elsewhere. So again, it's all just good sense for business to naturally be more inclusive and take advantage of that many more demographics.
I agree with both you, Josh, and both Trish. And I think all the work has to happen together from the workforce side and also from the employer side in order to really make an impact and a difference. We'll take one more question. I'll ask one more question because of time, and then we'll take some questions from online. And so we talked about being intentional with Eric, and then Deborah followed that up, and Deborah talked a little bit about the intersectionality of race and gender and how that affects the apprentice pay gap. We also know of the wage gap in America as a whole. And so the statistics, the American Center for Progress says that 84% of Black women are co-breadwinners in their home, and also 60% of Latino women are also the same primary co-breadwinners in their home. And so, how do we be more intentional in the registered apprenticeship space of creating registered apprenticeship opportunities that lead to the livable wage, that get a little bit closer to that $26.14 wage of the average white male apprentice, right? And so, Trish, I'll let you go first on that, and then Josh, I'll let you answer, and then we'll take some questions from the audience.
Well, we recently became acquainted with a group out of a workforce area that had just finished up with a WANTO grant. So that's Women in Non-Traditional Occupations, issued by USDOL. They were working with women from rescue, essentially, from domestic violence situations or trafficking. And their goal was to skill them up so they could enter the maritime industry down in our Tidewater section. The whole term of that grant went by and they hadn't thought to contact me or any of my people about the placement of these women. So the grant allowed them to spend $8,000 per head to help them get where they needed to be to enter that industry. But there's an alignment issue here where apprenticeship didn't get brought on. We are now dialed in with them, and they have 25 women ready to go that can go into these industries. So hopefully we will get them in front of our existing sponsors who have vacancies. And what we suggested is that we do a reverse job fair. So the potential apprentices themselves will present their resumes, they'll present their background, what they want to do, and they will Shark Tank the employers who have to go around and see what they can pick up. So it accomplishes several things. It gives women or anyone in that situation an opportunity to exercise and get confident in showing off their newly found job skills or whatever. And we all know you need to get that confidence to go in there and compete, especially if you're going into a male-dominated sector. So I think it's important to just try out new things and see if that helps provide this group of folks into those types of jobs.
And to piggyback off of Trish, I'll actually use a personal experience. When we talk about, how are we attracting women of color, Black mothers into registered apprenticeship? I think about the time when I used to work, when I was an apprentice, when I was a construction craft labor apprentice, and we worked on big jobs, big highway jobs. And we worked on those jobs, the flaggers, as you can imagine, flagging is probably one of the most dangerous jobs, at least as a laborer, it was dangerous for me when I would have to get involved with it. But when we looked at the flaggers, almost every flagger for every on-ramp and off-ramp was a Black woman, and many of them had children. Yes, it's fantastic money. They're great. We're making, $35, $36 an hour. But at the end of the day, once that job was over, what skills do they have to move on to the next job? They're flaggers. Well, what are we doing to help support them move up? What are we doing? And I would engage some of them, at times when I was in their area working, and I asked them, I'd teach them how to read the ruler. And I'd say, well, do you know how to read this ruler? Or do you know how to look at the plans? So it's engaging them. And that is the same mentality that I've brought to my position outside of building highways, into the boardroom and into being the state director. A strategy that we looked at is, how do we create shorter, stackable apprenticeship programs that can help upskill single Black mothers, while also giving them an opportunity to be involved in registered apprenticeship, and making sure that using our federal apprenticeship grant dollars to help provide supportive services to them for things such as childcare, transportation, tools, and such. We're now offering those supportive services to apprentices. So while they're not specific to single Black mothers, the goal is to support the apprentices during that apprenticeship to ensure we create opportunities for success. And with 32,000 single Black mother households in Wisconsin, we have a great opportunity for some focused work. Another example I love using, and I love this example, the iron workers, when they created their policy around maternity leave benefit. I think they were trailblazers back in 2017 at looking at how we make sure and we protect the women who not only work on our job site, but how are we going to protect those women who want to be iron workers and still build families? What are we going to do? What are we going to put in place that we can continue to recruit and successfully retain those great women who want to start families, right? So they were trailblazers in that, and many have followed behind that. But I agree, and Trish, this is to Trish's previous point as well, her previous question. You know, diversity gives you the access to a greater range of talent, and not just the talent that belongs to a particular worldview or ethnicity or some other restricting definition, but it helps provide the insight into the needs and motivations of all of your clients or customer base. And a large part of the workforce is women. So why are we not focusing on recruiting and getting them in rather than just a small part of it? And so a lot of the work, you know, I hope that we could continue to keep pace and remain relevant in some of the work that we're doing, even trailblazers for work for single Black mothers, and to develop some of those solutions just for all the perennial problems that of utilizing the model. And lastly, as Trish said, it's the bottom line, right? My job as the state director of Wisconsin Apprenticeship is to make sure that I do everything possible to ensure my Wisconsin apprenticeship employers can compete locally, nationally, and globally. And the only way they can do that is to become diverse and inclusive. It's not just to become diverse, but you also have to be inclusive. You have to have individuals having seats at the table to have those conversations.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Josh. I think that, you know, the supportive services piece that you touched on is so important. One of my last things that I did as director was create a supportive services program. And I think if we're going to get women and women of color involved in registered apprenticeship, that supportive services to pay for childcare is so critically important. So I would even encourage the colleges on the line that are looking to be involved in registered apprenticeship. That's a way that you can help. If you can find a line item to provide for supportive services for your students who want to be in registered apprenticeship, that would be great. And so we've got about 5 minutes. We're going to go rapid fire and try to answer as many questions as we can in 5 minutes. So I won't talk long and I'll let you all answer. So how can we have Black people who have the right education have the responsibility to recruit? And so that might not be the clearest question, but I think what they're trying to ask there's how does a company find African Americans that are able to recruit the correct African Americans for their company? And go ahead, Josh, and then Trish.
Real quickly, I heard this as a presentation. Somebody from the IBEW a year ago or 2 years ago at our apprenticeship conference, you know, they talked about as a company, they looked across the boardroom and they had nobody of color on their board. And what they did is they started to look internally and they realized they had nobody of color that worked for them as a company. So they went and they started to intentionally recruit to get individuals in the door, and then they start to develop them when they come in. The same process, the same mentality I utilize as well for my internal staff. I try to find individuals who are talented, who are diverse, bring them in, and then we develop. And I think as an employer, you have to be honest and open with yourself and look on that floor and say, what am I doing and how can I do it better? And be ready to admit that you're not doing it right. But that's okay if you're willing to take the steps forward to do it right. And that's where me, Trish, as well as the rest of the state directors in the national office, we can help guide you down that path.
Trish?
Sure. So technical assistance, we brought in the West Virginia Women Work Group that specifically helps employers look at their marketing materials. So, you know, in this day and age, everyone first looks at a website to see, hey, do I even want to go work there? My very largest apprenticeship sponsor in the state came to that workshop and she said, okay, everybody, pull up your laptop, pull up your own website. You want women to come to your company. Tell me what you see. And this guy just went, oh my gosh, my homepage, there's not a woman on it. And next page, not a woman on it. And she's like, yeah, it's really pretty simple. Optics and marketing, merchandising your company as something that, you know, that is welcoming to somebody. Same with people of color or veterans or any demographic you put together. It's that blinding thing that that author talked about.
Yeah. And so the next question is, many times, you know, people think about registered apprenticeship as just for a singular occupation or entry level job. So how can registered apprenticeship increase the diversity overall in a given company? Trish, we'll go back to you real quick, and then Josh will let you answer.
Well, we're trying to work real hard in our youth registered apprenticeship program and get into the entire school fabric in Virginia, get to the counselors, get to the career people, get to the people who still hold on to the idea that you're only a valuable human being with a bachelor's degree, and tell them otherwise, and offer these options to kids starting at age 16 and telling the employers, look, here's a way to do this. We've got a really robust youth registered apprenticeship program where we take a zip code approach and kind of match up those employers to every school and say, they're right in your own backyard. Start them now. When they graduate high school, they do another year or two and they are journey workers by the time they're 20. Guess what? No debt. They're buying a new truck. They're maybe buying a house in your community. That's how you richen the fabric in a local sense.
And you know, in continuation of that, you know, it's interesting. We've looked at that here in Wisconsin and how we address that. And we see construction and manufacturing. Those are our tradition, right? Those are the traditional occupations. And our goal is to push everybody that way and to say, hey, you can get great living, have a great career in these two areas. Well, that has come back to kind of backfire on us because now we're getting individuals who aren't necessarily interested in construction manufacturing, but are interested in other areas. So now we're having to kind of play catch up but start to develop all those new non-traditional sectors. So it's a conversation I've had with my staff, which is it's great. Construction, manufacturing, as well as other parts of apprenticeship are fantastic. They provide livable wages. They bring you to the middle class. They provided a great life for me. They created a great start to my career for me. But what about those other sectors that may be heavily focused and are easily and readily available to men and women of color? What do we look at those sectors and see if we can create registered apprenticeship programs for those employers to help upskill those individuals that they have no problem hiring? So we've looked at that and tried to address that, and we definitely still support obviously the traditional apprenticeship occupations, but we also have to be innovative. And if we don't become innovative, if we don't go down the path of trying to figure out how to connect men and women of color to those opportunities, then we will get passed up by other industries or potentially by other programs.
Thank you, Josh and Trish. And so about 60 seconds left. So the question is, Trish, you talked about marketing to get the diversity in the door. What's the word to companies on how they change their culture to keep diversity?
Well, I want to make sure employers know to come to us, come to Josh, come to me, come to every state apprenticeship agency you have. That is our job. We're cheerleaders, we're matchmakers, we're coaches, we're relationship builders, we're solving problems all day long to put this one together with this one. We know this entity will provide supportive services for returning citizens when they come out, and I have an entire committee devoted to that out of the apprenticeship grant. We're creating those solutions right there. Come to us first. I have 15 consultants in the field that develop relationships with the businesses and help them get their needs met. And we just do a lot of listening. We don't ever show up and say, hey, you know, register apprenticeship, that's the solution for you. We first say, you know, tell us about you and what is it you need? And let's see if we can get some solutions for you in a holistic fashion. So find your state apprenticeship agencies. I think I shared with you the NASTAD link, Joseph, that would be really good to share with your listeners today so they know where to go in every state to start off, because we're the subject matter experts. We can get them going.
It will be in the resources for the listeners. And Josh, real quick, about 30 seconds. What's your advice?
Couldn't have said it better than Trish. Come to us. Registered apprenticeship, state directors, the Office of Apprenticeship, come to us. We can help you. We will help provide you. In fact, we are happy to help you, and we will be happy to provide to you that technical assistance or to provide to you our staff to help guide you down that path. Come to us. This is as simple as I can get. Come see us.
Well, perfect. Thank you, Josh and Trish, for joining me today. Thank you all who watched on this conversation. Appreciate the questions. And now we'll pass it over to Eric to close this conversation out.
Wow. Well, great, everybody. Thank you. That was a fabulous, goodbye, everybody. That was a fabulous overview. Look, just give me about 90 more seconds. I'm going to get hit a number of points that were so important on this. And I do want to go back to purpose and intentionality, right? But these guys hit on some great points. So look, there's a lot of employers out there who get that their workforce does not reflect the communities they serve. There's more and more employers who are interested. Are Black workers better than white workers? No. Are women better than men? No. Well, maybe in some occupations, my wife would argue. But there has to be some intentionality to lift these opportunities up for those communities and those groups, right? Doesn't make it better. It just levels the playing field for access and opportunity. A couple of things real quick. We've got a workforce highway that's littered with some really bad pre-apprenticeship programs that have been nothing but life skills and a few other things. Are there some on-ramps we can do to provide people of color a little bit more access and preparation to enter registered apprenticeships, whether it's union, non-union, it doesn't matter. So can we create some more on-ramps for those populations, rural communities as well? I think a really critical point that Joshua made was, Black leaders and Black staff working throughout the system, either with communities or employers, sends like a huge message. And the fact that he's grown the diversity of his staff, I think, is really telling and important. And so that's just a really important point to make. When employers do apprenticeship for incumbent workers, and they're selecting, entry-level production workers to move up in an incumbent worker apprenticeship, what is their unconscious bias there? Are they giving opportunities to all of their entry-level workforce? And in some parts of the country, it's immigrants. In some parts of the country, it's African Americans. In others, it's women. Are they providing not only the diversity? Diversity is one point, but what is the equity, right? And one of these folks said that, how do you move people up? I have seen that flagger example all of my life, right? All the flaggers are African American and women, and guess what? They don't advance up from that. No, that's baloney, right? So get them in that opportunity, entry level, but let's have a strategy to move people up, not just keep them in the low-skilled, low-wage jobs that African Americans have always occupied in apprenticeship and the American workforce. Trish talked about purpose and alignment, really important. There's just so many good points made here. So I'm just going to wrap up. We would love to continue this conversation with many of you. I really like the honesty of this conversation and what we have to do. But you all on the call, right? What is the purpose and intentionality you can bring to the table? Your partners can bring to the table. And, let's ask employers if that's a population they want to serve and do better on. And again, employers do lead our way here. So we have to help influence employers to level the playing field and provide more opportunities. Barack Obama said that access and opportunity is for all Americans. It doesn't depend on your zip code, doesn't depend on where you're from. It depends on the access and opportunities that you're provided to succeed in the workplace and the economy. With that, I want to thank Joshua Johnson from Wisconsin, Tricia Morrison from the great state of Virginia, and of course, Joseph from the great state of Louisiana. Also want to thank all our JFF team who work behind the scenes and all of you for making time today. So with that concludes our session today. Once again, thank you. Really important issue we need to keep working on. Happy to hear from you when we get off of this call to discuss this important issue more. This concludes our session today. Thank you.